Bleh. Alright, let me lower it a tiny bit. That's working. That's working. That's working. Wah. Alright, minimize that. Narrowed it.
Of several characters and
There we go.
zombies we come across, as well as the general atmosphere overall. That's just the intro though, which in terms of the characters I think works well enough to show what all their roles were before this zombie outbreak. But when we actually end up hitting play, the first thing we're made to do is pick who we want to play as, including a fully voiced character bio when picking each individual one.
I have so many windows open.
That would be fine, but the game treats these bios like a get out of jail free card in many ways, as in the actual game, most of their backstories aren't elaborated on any further. And realistically, with how cookie cutter all of the dialogue is here, without reading these, you could go the entire game not really knowing about any of these characters' backstories
I got
and
one
be none
more
the
to
wiser
check.
by the end. Apart from maybe Sam B, these guys are the most bog standard, stereotypical group I could think of. And to be honest, that doesn't even get much better when looking at their bios, which makes me think their personalities weren't even a priority. Weird, considering they actually try to pull off emotional and impactful beats with these guys, which oftentimes are such a hilarious failure.
Alright.
But whatever. Chances are
Hello everyone. Hello.
Anyways, but instead for their styles and also perhaps their stats and abilities, which can also be seen under their name. But I'm gonna say for the record that none of these really matter. The fact is, you can pick whatever character you want and get through the game fine regardless, which is the appropriate option for a game that a lot of people will be playing by themselves. But as you can see, all the characters have varying amounts of health, speed, and stamina, with the different values being quite negligible between all the
Yes, you
characters,
can.
as the lowest one of these can get is Logan's stamina, which is set to 80. There's no actual clue on how this static number will affect the character's stamina in the actual game compared to the others, but I suppose it'll improve replayability in some ways. And of course, there's also their weapon specialties, ranging from Perna, who's a firearm expert, to Sam B, who's a blunt weapon expert. These most importantly affect the skill trees in the game, which for the most part are actually pulled off pretty well, but we'll get into them in a second. All you really need to be informed on here are the expert abilities. No matter who I was playing as, the stat differences were so minor, they never ended up affecting my experience in any way. Which is good to be honest, as if they did, I imagine I'd likely see that as a negative. But let's not forget, the most important reason these multiple characters are here isn't for variety in the single player, but instead the co-op mode, likely being the reason why so many people think incredibly fondly of Dead Island due to their time spent with friends. In my opinion, that's where this choice really matters, as although you can end up with 4 Sam Bs in your game at once, it genuinely makes for a more interesting and authentic experience if you've got one of each character on your team. The intro prologue is fine, having some nice references to the Dead Island trailer, where we can stumble across the bodies of the parents we see be killed. But it tries to start the game off with a sort of horror atmosphere, which once again just feels confused, as the game never ends up returning to this tone for the rest of the experience. But on the same merit, perhaps it only happens here due to the fact we're fresh out of water, and unsure about our environment and how powerful the zombies actually are here. It does give the player a good chance to get to grips with a few of the mechanics that are heavily emphasized over the game though. First of which being the looting, where we can search tons of objects like cupboards, luggage, and chests, which end up giving us money, weapons, and parts to upgrade and modify our weapons later on. It's primarily an atmosphere.
Is that Sonar or am I wrong? Yes, this is Sonar. I'm basically making an avatar for when I play the game. No spoilers! I have spent so much time avoiding spoilers.
in which our first combat encounter has us saving his life in return. So enough build up, let's actually get our teeth into
Technically, I already finished one part of the avatar. He basically looks like this.
Compared to many others. And
yeah,
I suppose
let me just disable that.
There's no better place to start than the combat. In my opinion, this is easily
I'm just doing a full body version.
The combat's pretty great throughout.
That's basically how he looks like.
Go into making it satisfying. Starting with the basics, as you see here, you can pick up a variety of weapons throughout the game to fend off against these zombie hordes. Yet another aspect that I think is pulled off.
I'm just doing a full body version.
The game off with more of a scavenger's mindset, scraping around for any kind of wooden paddles or planks that you can get your hands on. But after a certain point, you'll end up finding far more effective pieces of weaponry through your time searching. Weapons like machetes and sledgehammers, which as I say, can be found from optional exploration on the player's part, which is great, but are also given out from characters that we do quests for too. Using these weapons on the zombies lets us into numerous discoveries though, ones affecting our player, our weapons, and the zombies themselves. Whacking a zombie in this game will never not be satisfying to me. In terms of the damage that's conveyed on screen, hitting zombies with blunt weaponry like hammers and pipes shows the zombies being flung around.
This is so underrated.
Which is primarily because
I know I'm very underrated, but that's fine.
Which mainly present themselves when the zombies actually get killed. Most weapons have a fantastic impact on the zombies, once again varying between what type of weapon you're actually using.
I can see. You know, what am I doing? Why can I can just do this?
Huge amounts of blood will always be shooting out of the zombies regardless. But when using weapons like the machete, for example, you'll see that depending on what body part you're focusing your attacks on, there's a high chance for one of these.
Yes, I'm drawing sonar! Oh my god!
Or rendering them less.
Why is everybody so happy about it?
This is already immensely
Technically, I already drew him! I don't know if you were here, Lexi.
Only to have their head fly off in the final hit.
It's alright after you see a raptor in the will, the wild. Okay, that was just autocorrect for you. No spoilers! I haven't played the game yet, I just know that sonar exists.
It's not as visually striking as seeing the zombies' body parts fly off and fall to the ground, but still just as effective, with how we can target these same kind of body parts and actually...
But here, Lexi, since I guess you weren't here for this part...
...completely useless, as well as having the zombie's head be completely caved in, compared to being sliced off.
Here, this is the half body. I'm doing the full body avatar at the moment.
It introduces one of the
and technically, I still need to do the arms. I just
the flow of combat,
pretty much lazy.
Aspects like what weapons you're using, what parts of
and here's his talking animation.
Stamina during these encounters. Starting with the stamina.
We going yum 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 yum.
These combat scenarios, but also has many pitfalls, which made certain parts of the game arduous at points. Firstly, the stamina presents a good back and forth.
Okay. No spoilers! I haven't played, I'm just making the avatar, okay? That is it.
And with every swing from your weapon using
now everybody shush!
Once again,
if I miss out on like how he actually looks like in the game, that's on me, but still.
When going on the defensive. As you could assume, this is something that is brilliant at the start of the game, when the experience will be more linear and standard for most people's playthroughs, but does eventually end up presenting some issues in the latter parts of the game, when the zombie's health starts dramatically increasing in accordance with your rising level. Weapons you would have previously used become less effective.
No, you're peak. I don't know your name because it's all in
special enemies we can find eventually become incredibly
I'm just gonna
go up against.
It's in Japanese. I'm just assuming Japanese. I'm sorry.
Just used up during fights, however, but of course is also used when performing actions like jumping and sprinting, and running around in particular is something you do far too much of in this game, especially in the later areas, which I think are nowhere near as well designed as the initial.
How did I exactly draw? I feel like I
when
drew.
Just trying to get to somewhere can be very annoying, especially when there's no substantial.
I only drew him once, man.
It can sometimes be engaging when being chased by one of the.
But as soon as I play the game, I hope I get to like him. There will probably be some good juicy fan art of him when if I ever get around to it. He will be another husbando that I will claim.
And not to mention that when you have 0 stamina, you'll also be knocked over by any attack that comes up against you. Something I started off enjoying
Lunar
combat encounters, as once again,
hello, Lunar,
to and fro during the fight. But I quickly became annoyed due to it not really having any substantial impact.
Let me know if the video is too loud. Like I said, I literally just use it for background noise.
But you'll notice they just stand by and watch as you slowly pick yourself back up, which is very underwhelming. So stamina in general was great.
Like, I don't mind playing music, but at times I still want to listen to dialogue just playing in the background.
Solely to the attacks, to be honest, as it doesn't enhance any part of running about the world.
Alright, bye Lunar!
Were handled pretty well for the most part. As I mentioned, there's a nice progression we see throughout the game, where the more you level up, the higher tiers of weaponry you'll be finding, being categorized with a typical common, rare, and ultra rare tier system. The different types of weapons have different effects on the zombies. Knives, cut, morning stars, smash, and so on. But that's an element you'll actually want to be focusing on more, as it could change your playstyle quite a bit. These weapons all have stats, which can either be observed in your inventory, or more conveniently, when the weapon's lying on the ground. They use color coding effectively here, so that you don't have to actually read all the corresponding numbers and compare them with the weapon you've got in your hand. If the weapon you're about to pick up has a higher stat in any regard, the numbers will show up in green text, whereas if they're worse, they show up in red. Thing is though, there's a few personal choices which you might want to take into account when picking certain weapons, which actually brings a lot of depth here. Weapons are ranked on their damage, force, durability, and handling. Damage, of course, relates to the DPS of the weapon. Force relates to its knockback capabilities. Durability shows how much you'll be able to use it before you have to repair it again.
Squidward?
The weapon can be swung, and how much stamina will be using it. The two most important ones, of course, are damage and force.
I'll say, I don't even know what that even means.
You want to go for raw damage, or use the knockback capabilities to be safer during encounters. Knives, for example, hardly have any knockback to them, but can oftentimes have a higher DPS. Yet again, it's something that's been implemented into the game, where the player has to adapt to their own playstyle,
I got it. I feel like I almost messed up.
Even when taking into account their individual character's special abilities. Most of the time, the durability is fairly negligible.
But technically, I feel like I'm gonna mess up.
Handling doesn't just notify us about the stamina effects, but as you'll find, it also lets us know
I
about
will
the
do this part later.
Close-range weapons like the brass knuckles or diving knife are able to be used in very quick succession, which can rack up the DPS. Medium-range weapons are ones like the machete.
Technically, this is supposed to be
which can deal out some good damage while not taking too long to swing. And long-range weapons are ones like the sledgehammer and handbow, taking a large amount of damage with each swing, but having those swings take a much larger amount of time to pull off, leaving you more open to attacks as you rear up for one.
I will play Dispatch whenever I'm done with the avatars and whenever I have free time.
Something else you can do with all
which I haven't had. My days off are Sundays or Mondays, but I haven't had like any weekday days off in a while.
But is also effective.
So it's gonna be a while. I still need to finish South Park as well, so we shall see. If I finish South Park and still have like free time, I will probably do Dispatch afterwards.
I don't really know why they chose an automatic lock-on system when a crosshair would have been much more effective in not only targeting these propane tanks, but also the different parts of the zombies themselves. But it's serviceable enough to where I didn't have many issues with them. There is also ranged weapons like pistols.
I hope that's answered your question. My schedule is it's not the greatest because of my job, so I do what I can.
The punch the melee weapons have, and weren't ever that fun to use for me personally. The progression's also nowhere near as good compared to the melee weapons. The pistol's almost always the best option to go with, considering its very high damage outputs and stability.
Dispatch is a game you can finish in one day.
To be anywhere near as effective. I mentioned the durability system a second ago, and this can sometimes cause problems during fights. That actually being a good thing, as it then
Can I though? Can I finish it in one day?
I say in the
Some of us don't have that free time.
They aren't necessarily gone forever, taking us to the workbenches. These can be found pretty frequently throughout the world, but are always placed in your home bases like the lighthouse in the resort or the church in the city area. They're of course used to repair your weapons, but is also where you'll be done.
Hello, Antonio!
Around the environment and dead zombies. You can not only upgrade your weapon to give them better base stats, but there's also a mod tab where you can apply numerous different status effects to your weapon.
Antonio, I miss playing with my, my followers, more rivals. I know I'm taking a small break because I want to, do single player games at the moment, but just like, I kind of want to jump back into it.
And then add a mod to not just make them even more effective, effective, but also look even cooler too. There's tons of mods here, however they're only unlocked through blueprints which can be found around the world, or merely by completing particular quests. There's one final element that I want to mention in relation to the gameplay right now, and that's the leveling system. Completing quests and killing zombies garners you XP, and when you've got enough XP, you level up and gain a skill point, which can be applied to one of the 3 skill trees we've got here. The more you level up, the more XP you need. Pretty standard stuff. But unlike a lot of games during this period, which use skill trees to merely give the illusion of choice, depending on what tree you focus on here, you might be getting locked out of some pretty significant skills. The skills are the most vital aspect towards which character you want to choose, as although there is quite a bit of crossover between the different character skills, those being ones like unlocking health regeneration or letting you carry more items in your inventory. There's also plenty others which actually correlate to each character's expertise. Using Sam B as an example, across the Fury, Combat and Survival trees, we see the first 2 in particular are almost entirely focused around his increased effectiveness when using blunt weapons. The Combat tree gives us numerous upgrades in relation to increasing blunt weapons damage capabilities, and the Fury one is all in relation to Sam B's unique Fury moves, this merely being a special ability that we can activate in-game, which lets us deal out huge amounts of damage. That's the case for all the survivors, all catering to their abilities once again. Sam B has brass knuckles, Perna has a gun, and so on. Overall, the Fury ability is a fine inclusion, although it's not the power trip I was really hoping for. Especially with characters like Sam B, you've got to get right up close during the Fury, and with it not giving you any kind of invulnerability, it can actually be a lot riskier than you'd think. Back to the skill tree though, I'm mainly happy in relation to the different moves we can unlock, but aside from that, it's just very basic stuff. As you saw, things like damage increases, additional stamina, and increased XP and resources from fights is the norm, but it's in here where we also unlock abilities like the tackle, which can be very useful if you're looking to make your way through enemies quickly, or the brilliant head stomp ability, which can actually be upgraded twice to make it even more effective. I've played so many games at this point which use skill trees incredibly poorly, so although Dead Islands is still basic, I'm at least happy it uses it to create noticeable changes within the gameplay. It's not layered to the point of games like Skyrim, of course, where you'll be tackling the game completely differently depending on what upgrades you decide to choose. But it's fine, just fine. What's stuck in my mind more than anything in relation to Dead Island though is that atmosphere of the world. Not to be mistaken with the level design, I think the way the world is laid out can be shaky, going upon terrible at points. But it's the actual look of the game which is fantastic. The resort is by far my favourite location, having a unique sunny twist to tackling the undead, which fits in line with the overall more light-hearted atmosphere throughout the game's duration. The location feels very authentic, being filled with bars, huts and swimming pools. You really get the sense this place would have been swarming with holiday goers before they were mauled and transformed into the undead. Something else which reinforces the environment is the zombies themselves, most of which are wearing bikinis, shorts and no shirts. In terms of the level design though, I'm not too big a fan. I enjoy the closeness of everything here, both in terms of the actual distance between certain landmarks and objectives, as well as how enclosed certain spaces can get. You'll find yourself tackling numerous threats inside these claustrophobic huts, which typically presents a bit more panic to your combat encounters, as there's more chance of getting hit with less room to maneuver or escape. But even on the outside, I do still feel this claustrophobia in certain sections, which works well when making the zombies a more unavoidable threat that you can't just run around. Well, you can, but they'll oftentimes get a swing in, and the infected types are used as a preventative most of the time, so you have to stop and engage in combat. But for as much as I like the opening section, we also have to talk about the other areas here. For those who are unaware, the developers of this game are the same guys who would eventually go on to make Dying Light, a game with the same DNA as Dead Island, but having far more refined gameplay, and a heavy emphasis on parkour, which is pulled off incredibly well. The reason I mention this is because in the second location you travel to, that being Moresby, you definitely get the sense in Dying Light that this is the vision they were heavily invested in. However, in Dead Island, I don't think they pull it off all that well. The level design's pretty great, the claustrophobia I mentioned before is enforced even more here, with the best moments coming from the tight streets and alleyways, and the worst moments coming from a large amount of dead ends I ran across. The Dying Light comparisons become even more apt when you realise this area has more of an adherence to verticality, with several moments where you have to vault on boxes to get over walls and blockades, as well as climbing up and jumping over several rooftops. Unlike Dying Light though, the movement mechanics are incredibly clunky, leading to several moments where I've had to try and try again while falling off off the same objects, even though I thought I landed on them fine. The game doesn't seem like it's built for this type of traversal. Sprinting has a sort of wind-up, so you don't get an immediate momentum boost when attempting to make a long jump. And the jumping in general is just too finicky in relation to the objects you're made to climb up on. They don't let you jump high enough really, and the game would have benefited immensely from an actual vaulting system, where your character actually pulls themselves up onto structures. The bad movement does also translate to the driving.
Hello!
Yes, we have cars,
I don't even know how to pronounce your name.
I really don't think they should be here.
I'm just gonna call you Ami.
Some of the worst driving mechanics.
Hello, Joseph. I am working on Sonar Avatar for Dispatch.
Way too slippery when driving at high speeds. Crashing into anything.
No spoilers, because I have not played the game yet. Please.
You can't break through any objects here, and there's no kind of additional movement after you crash. It's just a straight stop. And on the definitive edition I'm playing on PC here, the turning was almost completely bugged for me. I'd have to keep moving left and right to actually get the steering to activate, otherwise it would just propel me in a straight line while I've still got the button pressed down. In the resort section though, the driving actually has a function. Things are spaced out enough to where it's still a viable and practical option. But in the city area, there's only 1 or 2 cars that we come across, having near to no functionality because of how many broken down cars and debris are scattered on the streets. The city itself looks good, not as strong an atmosphere as the resort, but undeniably thoughtful and layered environments. One thing this area has over most others is the weather effects we see here. Every single other location has static weather conditions. The resort is always sunny and never gets dark. But in the city, we see them not only experiment with different times of day, but we also see rain.
I watched a full gameplay video of it, so without spoilers, I'll just say it's crazy.
The rain on permanently, but I guess having it happen randomly does vary
can't wait to play it
quite a bit, and having that surprise make the location stick in players' minds more. There's not much to really say about the sewers in this section. About as linear level design as you can possibly get, with these hallways and box rooms which merely vary in size. And the visuals, of course, are nothing to marvel over either. Although down in these sewers, you'll end up stumbling across one of the proper special enemies in the game. I say proper because realistically, the thug zombie type is actually the first one which gets introduced. But their functionalities are merely being a bigger, more powerful zombie that has a much higher potential to knock you down when getting hit. I've never really been a fan of these. They lack the swift, satisfying combat of the normal zombies, and just end up being more of a damage sponge for you to wail on. The rest of the enemy types are very derivative of the special infected from the Left 4 Dead games, but they all work fine enough in terms of Dead Island itself. Suiciders and floaters
Hello, Daniel.
in the sewers. Suiciders literally being like the boomers, which explode when you get too close to them, while also being an effective enemy to deal damage to surrounding enemies too. And floaters being a slow big boy who spits out acids. The other enemy which shows up in the city is the ram, which are strong, durable enemies which charge towards you, almost like a certain other enemy I'm familiar with. There's also the punks, policemen and soldiers that we come up against throughout the game, which have AIs so dreadful they almost never know what to do when you're standing right in front of them. And finally, taking us to the jungle section, there's the butchers, a more interesting damage sponge enemy due to its sheer speed and visceral damage, actually making my encounters with them engaging compared to the thugs. There's not much to really say about any of these, to be honest. They vary up the zombies enough so that things aren't stale, but they're quite literally the opposite of innovative. Everything they present in this regard I can see pulled off a lot better by other games. Onto the jungle though, this is where we start getting into some of the really tedious parts of the game. I think an issue with a lot of these places is that, like the jungle for example, they already fail in a gameplay sense, but could ultimately still be relevant in a story sense. Think of Lost Izalith from Dark Souls for example. The entire concept of it is interesting because the world and story before this has already been intriguing. Even if you're unaware, every area we enter has certain narrative implications, and Lost Izalith is no different. It's just the fact that it was rushed out the door so quickly that it ends up being terrible. Dead Island could have hypothetically justified the existence of the areas outside of the resort if they were fun to play, or if it was really necessary to go to these places in terms of the story. And although that is the case, the story might be the worst part of the game for me. Personally, the only justification for these new locations is variety, nothing more. The city just about gets away with it, but the jungle was inexcusably
so let's draw a
league where we discover that all our characters are immune.
So I'm assuming you want me to draw a league lag?
Very simple setup.
I don't even know how to pronounce his name.
We just get some really
Let me try.
almost never work.
Did I get it right?
The idea to head into the city comes about when the character Cinemoy says his survivors are running low on supplies. The only issue is that all of these survivors and Cinemoy himself are not set up anywhere near enough to where this seems like a request that we'd actually go through with. Yet, we do. Or how about when we meet the character Jin, whose father gets infected in about 2 seconds after we meet him, and we're expected to care when he tells us to leave him behind. Like, yeah, obviously, go away.
Your art is good. Thank you.
Jin is about the best character the game creates, and that's not saying much.
Is it the Wolf Butler? Who's the Wolf Butler?
She travels with us, goes through some tough times in between, goes back to kill her zombified father, and then dies at the end in a hilarious way. It's another element that appears to be completely thrown to the wayside. The narrative that's portrayed in the
What video is this?
Unironically better than what we get
let's have a look-see.
The story is serviceable enough to where if you're playing online with friends and likely not paying full attention or even caring about the plot,
it's the rise and fall of Dead Island.
In fact, the cliche and schlocky nature of everything might actually end up enhancing the experience for your group. But playing by myself, I couldn't help but just be bored or feel pitiful for what I was witnessing. There is almost no point where I
So you want to play Monster Hunter Wilds? Not yet. I'm still waiting for them to finish updating it, or did they end, or did they finish like updating the game?
And that's the quests.
Like as in they're no longer gonna update the game anymore.
Throughout the entire game, and they go as follows: talk to a character marked with an exclamation mark on your minimap, in which I should also
I don't know who that is.
Takes away so much from the exploration due to you literally being guided with an exact line to your locations. Listen to them give some backstory about what they need you to do, which sometimes can be interesting. But that intrigue is almost immediately destroyed when you realize most of the quests are go here, fetch this for me, go here, kill this for me, go here, and that's actually about it. There are exceptions, of course. I enjoyed the ones where we actually entered into buildings like the hotel or the several houses around the city. And I also liked particular quests like the Head of Cerberus's, which has you running around rooftops and tracking down speakers. This quest being a great example of how taking away the objective marker actually makes you pay more attention to your surroundings and do some navigation based on your own intuition. And then there's also certain main quests which feature a bit more to them, like the final boss encounter, or as I said, the hotel mission. But they're all just way too standard. Even quests which seem like they have a unique twist to them all play out the exact same, because in reality you're still just clearing a room of enemies.
What are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about, man. I'm just doing a full body picture of Sonar.
There's a proper progression here. It's just like
Immortal Champ. Why are you focusing on that part? You're weird.
The jungle's an environment that starts off interesting, but is once again brought down by the layout of it. This is arguably the area you'll be doing the most running, which I mean is just
it's just a full body picture of Sonar. So
they're much more effective here, but you already know they're not the funnest thing to drive around anyway. The actual location looks pretty great, but is once again lacking the uniqueness that was in the resort section.
Thank you.
I could point the resort out as something that's distinctly Dead Island, but the jungle could realistically be in any game. There's a lack of personality by this point that starts to become an issue for me. Through interaction,
you guys are reading too much stuff. Like, oh my god, what is he drawing this?
The second key character of the game, being called Yerima, just like Jin.
Still really good. Thank you.
No character development, so in turn, I never really care about any of her motivations or well-being. You discover her in one of the few cutscenes throughout the game, and although these are all typically fine and played out in-game instead of a pre-rendered cutscene, it's in these where the tone gets really confused. You spend the entire game frolicking around, gleefully swiping heads off zombies, which the characters end up reciprocating in their voice lines. But then all of a sudden in these cutscenes, we get these sad pianos and strings, like they're trying to make an impact of some kind.
Time to redo this part.
Then give me what I need.
What are you saying, Dad?
Which obviously doesn't work, because no part of the actual game conveys an emotional tone at any point. From the jungle, we end up at the prison.
I want to play that game, but sadly I have to install Roblox.
And this is by far the worst area of the game. Those box
what part is someone focusing on, Daniel? They're focusing on the pause. Like this section that I'm drawing here.
The quests here too.
Even though it's just like, it's just a full body, picture of Sonar. Why are you focusing on that?
In exchange for his help, then another, and then another. It's just incredibly boring. And once we're done with Titus, we have a final boss fight against Ryder, that while not being awful, was nothing to write home about. You literally just survive against some zombies, and then take on an amped up, zombified version of Ryder, who they actually attempt to portray as a villain, despite us hardly interacting with him throughout the game, and only seeing him in person here.
Stay back!
They hardly
But yeah, I do want to draw Sebastian. I mean, for skits. As an avatar, Max?
Dead Island is one of those games
yeah, I can't really make it because, you know, the game doesn't exist anywhere else and I don't want to install Roblox for that.
Of the game, and it's like that's what they were relying on. That was their best idea, and formed a half-assed, pretty buggy game around it. The visuals, and I mean the graphics, are still fine for the most part. Some of the characters do look weird, to be fair, but all the environments and weaponry look great. The atmosphere is really good for the resort section, but gradually gets worse and worse in each consecutive area. And the story's so bland that the only thing that really stands out are the 4 characters we play as. Not to mention as well, that despite the sound in general being pretty great, with the guttural, brutal sounds that are let out from the zombies, as well as our weapons and the overall ambience of certain areas. The music is the only thing that's lacking. There's nothing that ever really stands out, it's all just very generic. Outside of that though, it's a game that has many pitfalls, but is unique and striking enough in its opening section to warrant the type of nostalgia that I and many others feel in relation to this game. I think we can all agree it's not a masterpiece, but it's like a relic of a bygone era. It's almost fascinating to go back and play this game, considering how the gaming landscape has ultimately tried to move away from this game's core design principles. Outside the story mode though, we can also mess around with One Punch mode, which is so much fun to play, with how your punches and kicks absolutely obliterate the zombies and fling them miles away.
Bloody hell!
And there's also the Rider campaign, that while not fixing any of the issues that are featured in the main game, at least gives some more context for the villain character, that I assume even the developers knew was poorly set up. Dead Island Riptide came next, and I'll be honest, there's not much to really say about this game when comparing it to the first one. Although it's not referred to as Dead Island 2, it's quite literally a sequel to the first game, and was only titled Riptide due to the fact there was less resources being pumped into it compared to the first one, which I assume was primarily because of the new generations of consoles coming in, where we obviously saw Techland ditch Dead Island in favour of Dying Light for these new consoles. Visually, it's pretty much identical. There are improvements in terms of lighting and particle effects, like when you deal damage to zombies, but that's only under very close observation. On the surface, there's nothing that stands out as being distinctly different. Same goes for the environments. We literally start the game off in almost a replica of the jungle section, with some additional annoyances in the form of the swamp areas. Okay, I'll be honest, these are fine, and actually pretty immersive when using the new boat vehicle, which at least functions far greater compared to the cars. But when you're on foot, these slow you down so much, the journey becomes a pure slog, with the narrative being the same base concept of the first. The most I can really talk about are some new gameplay concepts and the skill system. Riptide features a nice thing where you can now see all your other teammates at your home base, and on top of that, you can also do certain side quests for them too, to get rewards in return. In these home bases, you'll end up having to fend off against the undead within a certain area, something which was explored in the Arena DLC for the original game, but done very effectively here also. It's just a mechanic which leans heavily into the combat by throwing large hordes at you instead of the more sporadic placement of zombies in the open environment. The skill system, despite being very poorly integrated in terms of the game's balancing, is merely a more expansive version of what we saw previously. The reason I say it's badly integrated is because you start the game off this time at level 15, regardless of what build you can now pick for your character, those being ones more involved in combat, survival, or just getting the skill point yourself and choosing what to invest in. This makes the intro less friendly to newer players, considering the increased zombie levels too, which means more health and higher damage outputs. And you've also got to consider that in the first game, by the time you've reached this level, you would most likely have acquired and upgraded some weaponry, whereas here there's this confused approach of giving you some terrible weapons off the bat, which makes killing zombies a chore. Then they give you some incredibly powerful weapons to cap off the prologue, and then they strip them all away from you again. The skill tree is good though, with some slightly more unique abilities on offer here. One thing I really liked was how you could import your Dead Island character from the first game and play as them here, which means any abilities like the Stomp or Tackle would also carry over. But here, aside from the typical damage and fury upgrades for their individual characters' strong abilities, we also have things like being able to get up faster when getting knocked down, or a skill which deals increased amounts of damage to the opposite sex. Still basically serving the same purpose from before, but having more variety, which is always welcome. Overall though, Riptide, not a fan. There's way too many bugs which carry over from the first game, like how it's incredibly easy to get yourself stuck in certain parts, requiring you to restart from a checkpoint. I still don't like how your kick can oftentimes be far more effective than your actual weaponry, and realistically, the only positives I pick out from the experience are more nuanced to what's actually introduced in this game, and even then, they have counterpoints which makes me wonder if they're better off without them. The Drowners, for example, were a new type of zombie that reside in the swamps, either bursting up and surprising you on foot, or grabbing on and potentially knocking you off your boat. They're good, you have to take more consideration in your actions, and have to actively use the boost ability on your boat to counteract these guys' incoming attacks. But then, you've also got the swamps themselves. I don't really like them at all, and would take the trade of getting rid of the Drowners if it meant the swamps were made more satisfying to traverse. But that's not all, of course. We also have yet another cloned area of the first game, and that's the city of Henderson, which does look very nice to be honest, and isn't laid out anywhere near as bad as the jungle section either. By this time, you would have stumbled across the rest of the new special enemies here, which I mean visually look good, but I mean come on. The wrestler literally looks like the Charger from Left 4 Dead, and is another one which just smacks you around. The Grenadier almost has the exact same functionalities as the Floater, by being a zombie with toxic ranged attacks. And there's also the Screamer, being the only truly unique one here, by letting out an incapacitating scream when you're close to it. Stepping away from Riptide though, as I said, I don't find much merit or interesting things to actually say about it. Only this year did we finally get the true follow-up to Dead Island in the form of Dead Island 2, a game that was in development hell for around 10 years, being passed through numerous different developers' hands until it was finally completed by Deep Silver Dambuster Studios. And for a game that seemed like it was inevitably going to be a nightmare, I was pleasantly surprised that it not only fixes tons of issues I had with the first two games, but in general I found to be a pretty satisfying experience all round. Now, it sticks quite close to the core values of the first game, which I think is good, but has led to some criticisms about the game feeling outdated, which, to be honest, with how similar these larger gaming experiences are starting to become, is almost like a breath of fresh air. Starting with the positives, the game looks fantastic. I really like the Los Angeles environment we're set in, which despite not really being an island, I think features areas which are far more consistently good in both their design and atmosphere. At the start of the game, you're still able to choose what character you'd like to play as, now switching out the old ones for new modern characters, which, despite not minding any of them really, I also found weren't striking in their own rights. The overall writing of the game can go from cliche to cringy, and your character's dialogue, which can now be heard very frequently, is usually the worst reflection of this.
Bruno, you may now kill the bride.
For my first playthrough, I played as Bruno, who I merely found to be serviceable. Only towards the closing parts of the game, where they try to make you care about the protagonist, did I realise I didn't really care about him at all, which goes for most of the other characters we meet throughout the game. Yet again, bar for Sam B, the only returning character from the previous games.
Hey, Emma's pretty shook up. How about you fix her some of that motherfucking Yorkshire pudding shit she likes?
It's a Dead Island game though, and everything would end up falling down if the combat wasn't up to scratch. Thankfully though, I really loved it, and it's once again the best part of the experience. All the updated weaponry looks fantastic, and the overall progression here I found to be a lot smoother than previously, with your escalating level eventually leading to your older weaponry becoming pretty useless against the zombies, which also level up alongside you. A negative in terms of attaching to and holding on to weaponry you're familiar with, but a major positive in making you vary up the weapons you're upgrading and using, which of course puts even more weight on your exploration, as you'll need quite a large amount of money and resources to level these up this time round. All the elements like damage, force and handling still come into play here, with large hammers taking long to get hits off but letting out large amounts of damage in return, something which is amplified even more with the charge attack which is featured here, an element which feels essential here and will always be missed when going back to the previous titles. Some of the best changes come in the form of the stamina and the zombies themselves. Stamina's no longer used up while sprinting and during combat, which in terms of the exploration I was very happy about, considering it wasn't just annoying to be constantly running out of stamina in the first game, but also because vehicles are entirely removed here, which if the first game's driving mechanics are anything to go by, is a major positive. During combat though, I was initially hesitant. I wasn't sure if this was going to mess up the satisfying flow which was present in the first game, but this couldn't be any further from the truth, as I believe Dead Island 2's combat excels in so many more ways. In exchange for there being no more stamina issues during combat, the zombies are now more visceral with their attacks, which ends up putting more emphasis on your movement and positioning. This mainly comes in the form of the dodge and block abilities we now have, where with the dodge, we can swiftly move out the way of a zombie in preparation for a devastating counter, or instead parry with a block for the same effect. Another thing I was worried about was the satisfying aspect in relation to the destruction of the zombies. The game starts off with the zombies appearing to be less reactive to our hits, almost standing in place and taking this onslaught without being flung around that much. But this changes pretty quickly when acquiring some of the more devastating weaponry, where a lot of these almost feel like I've turned on one punch mode with how they get wildly flung around when being hit and killed. The sheer gore that's on show here might be some of the best I've ever witnessed in any game, primarily because it's dynamic and isn't solely limited to set animations that we would have seen previously. Hitting zombies still has blood bursting out of them, but now we can see this blood accurately laid down when falling to the ground, which ends up interacting with other fluid systems in the game to even greater effect. Status effects are used really well here, where now items like the jerry can and the brand new water can can be thrown and exploded to either set the zombies alight or merely douse them in these fluids, which, as you could assume, means the gas can then be ignited to set them on fire, and the water can be electrified to electrocute the zombies. And talking of that, the gore elements are just astounding. In terms of the fluid example I just mentioned, the zombies will be completely scalded upon these status effects being applied to them, but that's not even mentioning the raw damage here. Continuing to wail on zombies reveals the physics-based gore system that's been put in place, where not only can each individual body part be maimed and cut off, but also when looking to their innards, we see their entrails have dynamic physics to them, with the same going for their jaws and skulls, which can be destroyed bit by bit, so their jaw is either loosely hanging from their mouths, or completely removed. There is still somewhat of a damage sponge nature to these guys, but because of how satisfying I found the damage effects and the combat in general to be here, I was more willing to get into even the most optional of fights, whereas before I found myself just trying to run past everything after a certain point. There's a lot of elements that have been reworked and streamlined here, which I think were all appropriate for the most part. The skill system, for one, has stepped away from leveling up skill trees, and instead changed to these skill cards, still having several different trees, with cards that adhere to different types of ability and survivor skills. I do enjoy this system even more than the one before though, as unlike back then, there's not only more noticeable effects which get applied, like the ability to have zombies explode after being killed, or the dropkick and ground pound abilities that can be applied. They're also static. We don't have to gradually upgrade different abilities to get what we really want. We're given the skill immediately, with the main choice coming from a personal decision on what skills we'd like to choose over others. Something that could become quite a hard choice, considering how many good abilities there are here. Once again, working very nicely to vary up and adhere to different players' playstyles. And we also have the return of the workbenches to repair, upgrade, and modify our weapons once again. This being the most noticeably streamlined element for me, with how modifications are now handed out far more sparingly, and apply to most of the weapons you acquire, instead of the more restrictive process from before. With there also being several other mods we can add aside from the status effect, which further improves elements like how much damage the weapons give out, and making their ability to damage limbs greater. There are certain trade-offs which could be made here, like the upgrades which add damage to the weapon but reduce its durability, but for the most part, a lot of these are just static upgrades, which is perfectly fine. Something else I really enjoyed was the game's overall structure, and also the quests we tackle while going through the story. The plot is once again all based around us being immune, and hoping to acquire a vaccine with our blood. I mean, it's literally one for one the same thing. Our main objective for the first half is to get to a doctor, just like the first game. But unlike there, where every single quest was pretty much the same thing, rinse and repeat, there's a lot more variation to both the main and side quests here. You're going through more unique structures here, and achieving objectives that actually feel like they're pushing the narrative forward, not just stalling time while you're waiting to travel to the next area. There's some really fun ones here, like when we have to creatively kill zombies in a number of ways for a social media influencer, although some of the things she says are foul and totally unredeemable.
Let them bodies hit the floor! And no swearing in the first
Or when we end up in a hotel and have to face off against the towering Goliath of Becky the Bride. There's just so much more to actually see here. It's not just fetch quest after fetch quest. And even within these quests, different events happen during them which are unexpected and throw us off guard. Like when we end up gaining the Fury ability for the first time. We're merely supposed to be heading through the sewers, but get cut off by what we perceive as a new antagonist, and thrown into a pit of zombies below. I can't think of one moment like that from the first game, at least not one that's played out as well as this. The only objective that I really think gets repeated over and over is the kill 'em all task, which locks us into a certain area and has us fend off an onslaught of zombies, much like the defense missions from Riptide. But once again, the combat is so satisfying that I have no issues with these at all. In fact, I was always pretty excited when I'd see the message flash up on screen. Dead Island 2 somewhat exposes how simple the fixes were to merely make the first game a more satisfying experience all round. The combat in both games is great, albeit quite a bit better in the second game, but all that would have been needed to keep the first one engaging engaging for me is a proper narrative progression. Dead Island 2's isn't good, but at least it's always in the foreground. The original doesn't even feel like anything's connected for the majority of it. Another improvement I see in this sequel was the complete removal of human enemies, even though I'm sure they could have pulled it off fine enough. The zombies still present enough variety to not get stale for the endurance of the game. Most of the enemies are pretty much the same, to be honest, with some different variations on ones like the Screamer, who also features an electric counterpart, or the Crusher, which is basically the Thug, but with more distinct abilities, like a ground smash, which can knock you over. But the newest stuff comes in the form of the different zombie types, and the brand new Mutator enemy. The Mutator being a grotesque abomination, which is very durable, deals out high amounts of damage from its hits and spikes, and can also deal out those AoE attacks the Crushers do. It's easily one of the strongest enemies in the entire game, and that's probably why it gets reused for the final boss encounter, despite also seeming quite lazy to me. The boss fight itself actually being one of the most difficult triumphs I've pulled off in a game as of late, though while making me incredibly angry at the time, was pretty fair and intense all things considered. But the zombies themselves also have various types, which are immune to certain weapons and modifications. Firefighter zombies, for example, were completely invulnerable to fire damage, and the same goes for the incendiary Crushers and Walkers. And although this can be annoying at points, in a game sense, it's making the player more aware of the weaponry they're using, and requires them to not just switch up their weapons, but also, if you don't have any appropriate weaponry to deal with these things at the time, will encourage players to be more varied with their modification choices in the future. Wrapping up the experience though, the sound in general is fantastic, with all of the hits and swipes on the zombies sounding meaty and damaging. As well as all of the gun sounds being grand and explosive. The music, despite still being pretty bland for the most part, at least has some more engaging moments, particularly during some of the defense objectives. The cutscenes, which are frequently scattered throughout the game, all look good, and due to my character actually interacting with the people this time round, I was more willing to engage and actually invest in this very by-the-numbers plot. Throwables, which were featured in the previous games, are now a special ability, which features a cooldown timer, much better than the awkward throwables that we previously had to switch to like an actual weapon. Despite hearing criticisms that the environments are bland and too similar to each other, I thought they all looked great and worked better as one cohesive experience, compared to the other games, which put variety over an actual believable location. And there's some real subtle things I can praise the game over, like how the medkits are actually effective this time round, due to the snacks being far less common than before, which I should mention were essentially the main way of replenishing health in the previous games, or how searching through trash cans and suitcases this time round is far more convenient, with how opening these up automatically gives us the resources, instead of requiring separate button pushes to actually get them. Kicks are now almost useless outside of our drop kicks and our stomp, which is a huge positive, considering our kicks were almost more powerful than our weapons in the previous games. The guns here don't just sound good, but they're also incredibly satisfying to use now, with certain ones like the hunting rifle exploding zombies' heads with ease. And although the writing can at times be awful, they at least convey the tone a lot more clearly than before. Even in its most serious moments, things are still handled pretty lightheartedly, which I think is more than fine for the type of game this is. Yes, it feels derivative. Yes, I can clearly see things which have been snatched by other games like Dying Light. And no, I don't think it's a masterpiece, but it's an experience that I was fully invested in while playing, and was satisfying enough for me to want to go back and experience it again through the eyes of another one of these characters. Just so you're aware, I'm taking no pity on this game because of the development issues. If it was awful, I'd say it's awful, but it's really strange the backlash this game has gotten, because I think it's genuinely good. Time might warp that belief perhaps, but I had a lot more fun with this game compared to anything else that's been coming out in recent memory. The YouTuber Critical described this game somewhat as comfort food, and I completely understand what he means by that.
Because it's a comfort food. You know exactly what you're getting when you order the Dead Island dish. You're getting a generic zombie experience, but it has that extra seasoning of some very, very beautiful gore.
It's like we're playing an updated version of an old relic, but despite the game's shortcomings, I thought it was not only great by itself, but a vast improvement on what we saw before. And finally, despite the level design not being drastically different from the first, there's way more interactivity within the environment here, which can lead to some good puzzle solving moments. They are all pretty simple to be fair, just things like finding circuit breakers to unlock doors, but it's another element which makes you take in the world more and actually appreciate the design of it. A much better improvement over Dead Island's original map system, system, which basically had players gluing their eyes to the white dotted line the entire time. So there you have it. Dead Island is a franchise that has a strange amount of love surrounding it, and by the end of checking these games out, you can really see where this was initially garnered. Dead Island was released during a period where zombies were still fresh, and the ideas it was presenting were ones that broke certain conventions, like having zombies always be revolved around darkness, night, and bleakness. Whereas I really don't think the originals have aged all that well, the redeeming factors they do present are ones that are still vivid in my memory. It's a game that stands out, as opposed to being merely forgotten, and with the sequel, they only amplify that aspect even more, using highly detailed, real-world locations, and one of the best gore systems in gaming, to once again prop up what could be a pretty banal experience. But in my eyes, it's actually nice to have a fully fledged experience nowadays, considering so many games now are released in an unfinished and buggy state. It does have DLC, but nothing that would make anyone feel like they're truly missing out on something core to the game. Overall though, I'm still a fan of the series. It presents an atmosphere and gameplay system that hasn't quite been replicated by another game in its genre, a hard feat for even some of the best games which released. And although the nightmare of Dead Island 2's development could possibly lead to the series never seeing a new entry again, I'm glad the world actually got to experience this sequel, because for many Dead Island and zombie fans, I can guarantee that if you're looking for violence, blood, and gore, these games definitely don't disappoint. And if you want some side-scrolling zombie action, they've also got you covered with the Retro Revenge spin-off game, that while of course not being as substantial as the mainline games, still presents some rhythm-based CRT screen gory action that can be good to kill some time with. Although Techland's Dying Light series seems to excel in a lot more departments, Dead Island will always be a series that I'll keep coming back to as the years go on. Not solely for the obvious things like the combat and gore systems, but also for a morbid curiosity in terms of how these games are going to age over time.
Video's over. Wah.
Capcom is one of those companies that I've always been surprised with. Unlike a lot of people, they never usually spring to mind when thinking of my favourite game companies. A bit like how I said Valve didn't either. But once again, I don't really know why that is, considering the sheer quality that's been pretty much consistent throughout their entire history. Resident Evil, Devil May Cry, Mega Man, Street Fighter, Onimusha, not just being published by Capcom, but actually made by them. They're an incredibly innovative game company, and have been making stuff from before I was born. But the topic of today's video is a franchise, and I suppose a company, that is very close to my heart. And that's both the Dead Rising franchise and Capcom Vancouver. Now the first thing to note about Dead Rising 1 is that it was made solely by Capcom. The Vancouver branch was initially known as Blue Castle Games, who before taking on the sequels, made such classics as The Bigs, MLB Front Office Manager, and of course, The Bigs 2. So it's important to recognise that despite Blue Castle perfecting the franchise in my eyes, it was once again spawned from Capcom itself, and more specifically, Keiji Inafune. I bet I got that wrong. Looking at Dead Rising has become even more interesting as the years have gone on, being one of the standout launch titles for the Xbox 360, and I can't deny, that aspect of the game shows itself off from start to finish. We play as Frank West, who looks like a more confused Ben Affleck. The plot set up straight away from this intro set piece. Zombies have taken over a town called Willamette, and you're heading into the mall for some reason. I mean, I understand that's where the game is, but you could have got a better reason than just drop me onto this place where I'll most likely die. But in reality, that kind of sets the scene for the entire game. Does it make sense this character would strand himself here, not even knowing if there's anyone inside apart from zombies? No. But he does it because he's Frank West, a man who runs around like he's constantly shat himself. The bit leading up to this is very boring, just slowly moving along the street snapping pictures of stuff, which in reality doesn't change anything in the grand scheme of things. It sets the scene, I suppose, but it already kind of gets set before and after this. Luckily you can skip it though. So, if it wasn't obvious enough, this game is basically Dawn of the Dead, the video game, all taking place inside a zombie-infested mall. It's not only a pretty ambitious setting to begin with, only having a set number of areas you'll be going to to throughout the entire game, but I personally feel everything around this almost set it up to fail, but somehow everything just ended up working. The game essentially boils down to main and side quests like a lot of other games, most of which either involve going to somewhere to talk to someone, helping a survivor, or to take out one of the many psychopaths. But it's everything surrounding these quests which make Dead Rising still stand out all these years later. The general gameplay is incredibly freeing and brings a fresh approach in terms of how you interact with your environment and how you deal with the zombie horde within it. I'd say the biggest USP this game has is the sheer amount of things you can pick up and use to fight back. You aren't given a particular weapon you need to use. You've got several inventory slots where you can pick up and store weapons. This leaves more room for experimentation, as you're not limited to solely what you can carry with your hands. And also, depending on what weapons you have, you might want to save particularly effective ones for boss fights or larger hordes of zombies. It's important to note though, not every item you pick up can be stored, for whatever reason. You can manifest a sledgehammer out of thin air, but doing that with a mannequin is one step too far apparently. Weapons do vary quite drastically in their effectiveness, and you'll quickly come to realise that despite picking up benches and teddy bears to fight back with might be fun for a bit, there's not really any reason to use them after a certain point. An item like the teddy bear takes ages to kill a zombie, and would only really be used to either stun or knock them over, but you might find yourself needing to do that at certain points, as every weapon you pick up has a certain level of durability, and depending on what you're fighting, most things can actually break pretty quickly if used for even just a short period of time. I can understand how this could be annoying for some people, not being able to attach to certain weapons and play a favourable way, but you also have to consider how well the fragility of weapons fits into the overall picture. Weapons running out means there's an unreliability to every encounter. For example, if your chainsaw breaks in the middle of a zombie horde and you've got nothing else to replace it, what are you gonna do? Either adapt to the situation if possible and use the nearest items around you, or just straight up die. I wouldn't say any of these games are particularly difficult, but do require a considerable amount of forethought before just rushing forward. Another thing you'll want to think about is your health, starting off very minimal with only 4 squares, with each time you get grabbed removing one. The last square will oftentimes not get wiped out immediately, giving a nice feeling of just managing to escape out alive. But to regenerate these, you'll need to find health items around them all. Just like the weapons, these are also varied, both in the visual sense and their functionality. Not every piece of food or drink you find is going to be a lifesaver, with a lot of them only restoring around 1 or 2 squares. But getting your hands on items like milk or the seemingly godlike orange juice isn't what I'd call a rare occurrence, but definitely a less common to find. Those restore several squares of health, and you'll typically want to fill at least a couple slots of your inventory with these, just to be safe. Thing is though, as you progress through the game, you'll be given PP, prestige points, sure. There's multiple ways to attain this, ranging from killing zombies to taking photos of things, and once you've got enough, you'll level up. However, unlike most games you see nowadays, there's no actual skill tree. The game decides for you what you're gonna get, whether it be a health, attack, or speed increase. You've got no choice over the matter, which I see as a huge positive, both in terms that it gives a sense of unease or relief depending on what kind of situation you're in, perhaps getting that long-awaited health upgrade after being near death multiple times, but also because it removes the annoyance which is just skill trees in general. I was only trying out Horizon Forbidden West the other day, and the second I saw all these different skill trees with varying improvements to certain elements of the game, it just became so confusing. This streamlined approach fits very well, and oftentimes directly correlates to the intensity of certain situations. If you had the health you have at the end of the game when coming up against the prison convicts for the first time, it wouldn't be anywhere near as intimidating. Although, considering how buggy this game is, it's not like you'll be having a hard time anyway. That's something which my mind instantly goes to when thinking of Dead Rising. There's an almost charming level of jank to this game, and compared to some of Capcom's previous games, just has this sort of bare feeling. Take Leisure Park for example. It's this big patch of land, where even at night time, shadows are being cast by seemingly nowhere. The moon does not count here, and in the daytime, your shadow somehow overlaps another shadow. It is genuinely like looking back to an old relic, with these incredibly low-res, flat grass textures, and seeing zombies pop in from the distance. But as I said, it's got charm to it. The bugs aren't so heinously bad they'll ruin your experience, but they're definitely present. As you've probably noticed, we can also switch up our clothing, both in a way to appear downright insane, and also to maybe appear a bit more lavish. Pathetic. This once again is another unique element to Dead Rising. Alternate clothing has obviously been done before, but there's a particular authenticity to how it's presented in this game. Go into a kid shop, you'll end up with a bare midriff and a horse head, but head into a men's apparel shop and you'll get a snazzy little suit. I've always appreciated that element in these games, giving us quite a large amount of customizability, despite playing as one set character. It's on the cusp of being an RPG, but as I said, stays away from the elements which would bog down the experience. The actual zombies in this game I think are excellently implemented, as it's one of the only games where zombies actually feel like zombies. They're really slow for the most part, with their primary way of walking being a shuffle, a slightly faster shuffle, and then later in the game they'll do a light jog. On their own, they're easy to handle, but what makes them intimidating is how many get thrown at you. There's a very clever and subtle progression to these guys. Just compare these clips, one being right at the start, and the other being towards the end. You can see that as the game goes on, more and more zombies fill up every area, not only becoming more dangerous for you to navigate, but also poses big issues for the survivors you'll be taking with you. Their only way of attacking, as you could assume, is to grab, hit, and bite you, which is an element which started to annoy me as the game went on. I think this first game might be the most intimidating, and I suppose you could say realistic. Nah, you couldn't say that. But in this game, the zombies are actually a threat. You'll want to avoid them whenever possible, and take out the ones that are in your way. These things love to grab you though, and I'm actually glad they do, because as we'll see in later games, if you can just run past these things easily, pretty much all threat is removed, and in turn dampens the overall gameplay. The only change I would have made is to either have Frank escape automatically, or just have a button prompt, which it occasionally does do. Waggling the stick is just a really annoying thing to do over and over, and for me actually ends up hurting my hand. But outside of that, I'd say everything's pretty perfect. The satisfaction from mowing down zombies doesn't just come from the gore, or the sound, or the sheer number you can mow down. I think it's directly linked to how they're seen as a dangerous hazard. They're not a nuisance. There's obviously a cognitive dissonance in relation to the fact they can bite you, but at the same time, you see characters later turn into zombies after being bitten. But in a game as off the wall as this, it doesn't really matter.
It's because you're Viet Cong. I'm right. Aren't I?
Not to mention, when the weird religious type cult gets introduced, things become even more interesting, as well as visually appealing. Outside the psychopaths, the only other enemies you fight are these cultists, and later in the game, special forces. The cultists wear these bright yellow coats and green masks, which I think is some excellent visual design. They also make tons of really strange sounds, turning them, for me, into an even freakier presence than your standard zombies. What makes these guys perhaps even more satisfying to take out though, is how they typically bunch up together, pretty much begging for you to take one large swipe at them with a sledgehammer. The special forces are a bit more standard, however, showing up right towards the end of the game and shooting anything on sight. These guys show up all over the mall and arguably become the biggest threat in the game. Only thing is, the machine gun they drop, which I have to assume is supposed to be used back on them, doesn't work that well. I think that goes for all the ranged weapons in this game for me personally. On a controller,
making the avatar right now
stunted, and whenever you aim, there's no actual animation to cover the camera transition, so you just get this straight cut to a different angle, which is a bit weird. Not to mention that slicing and dicing is just a whole lot more awesome than taking these things out from a distance. So, the actual missions in this game are kind of hard to explain. Unlike most games where you can pick out certain missions which are particularly great, the whole experience here is pretty much consistent with everything else in the game. It's all focused around maximizing the time you spend doing things in the mall. So whereas some games are praised for their main missions and criticized for their side missions, or vice versa, the missions here are pretty much interchangeable, which links to another unique aspect of this game. The case files seem like the main task, heading after the antagonist Carlito, and along the way meeting new characters, like Isabella, Brad, and Jessica. But the interesting thing is, if you end up failing one of these missions at any point, the game will ask you to either load a save, or just continue playing. As you might forget whilst playing, the ultimate goal really is to get out alive. This is something they really didn't need to do, and for me, playing through the game without having this overarching narrative just seems a bit aimless. But for those who really aren't interested and just want to mess around, you can absolutely do that.
Not on my watch!
And what I said about the case files not having any real highs, I stand by that, but it sure has some lows. The first mission that should come to mind if you've played this game is the bomb disposal mission. And I don't want to hear any bullshit about, oh, you can just bring quick step in, oh, it's actually really easy when you break it down. Nah, this mission is terrible. What should be a cool level where you're riding around this maintenance tunnel on a bike, getting chased down by Carlito and collecting bombs, turns into an absolute slog when this fragile bike combusts on you. The best way to bypass this is to take Carlito down, at least letting you collect the bombs while only having to deal with the zombies, which, due to the sheer amount of them in this large area, isn't too fun either. Some of the best moments in the entire game come from the cutscenes found in these case files though. Let me just give you an excerpt.
But he's running a fever. He needs medicine.
A fever. Medicine, huh?
Almost as if
Everyone's already dead.
Yeah. I took that one near the entrance. That guy do something?
That's what I love about this game, and Capcom in general. They're very aware of what kind of game they're making. So even though you've got all this serious music and dialogue, it's always going to be contrasted not only with what you do in the actual game, but also any of the weird clothing that you bring in with you.
Now, what do you know about all this anyway?
And of course, how could we forget essentially the highlights of the entire game, the psychopaths. Just like the optional survivor quests, these are completely missable, and on your first time round, you'll most likely not see all of these. The reason for that is due to the fact that every single mission is on a timer, and what sounds like an insane annoyance actually works really well in practice. I think it's primarily due to both the overall size of the mall, not having to trek too far to any given location, and the fact that it actually brings some tension and immediacy to what could result in a very lackadaisical experience. Anyway, the psychopaths are brilliant encounters, and it's less to do with the actual fight, because in reality you could use a weapon like the small chainsaw and wipe them out pretty quickly, but more to do with the batshit insane personalities, all of which are unique and varied in their own right.
Non-believer in our midst.
You've got a store owner who's clearly gone insane after the zombie outbreak. You've got a paranoid Vietnam vet, and you couldn't have a Wonderland section without some kind of psychopathic clown. These are all balls to the walls mental, so if you had any doubts in whether they were taking this game 100% seriously, all you need to do is look at these guys. Even though these aren't necessary to complete, they're still worth doing for the experience alone, and also the fact that most of these guys also drop unique weapons, which are typically better than most things you'll find, and also respawn when coming back to the area they were in. But all in all, that about wraps up Dead Rising. It laid the foundation for a zombie killing sandbox with specific influence from George Romero, and something that nobody seems to have mentioned, a very similar tone to the works of David Lynch. Almost every single line of dialogue in this game is delivered in that same stunted fashion as Twin Peaks.
There's a helicopter coming. 3 days from now. At noon, it's my ride.
Do you know where dreams come from?
While not being particularly mind-blowing, the gameplay presented a freedom, with the large amount of items you could pick up and use. And the story overall was pretty standard, but even just having small inclusions like taking your current character's appearance directly into cutscenes, and the nice sense of cheese which permeates throughout, it actually ends up taking us deeper into the experience and these characters' struggles. We then got Dead Rising 2 4 years later. That's right, an entire video game made in the span of 4 years. Kendrick, start taking some notes. He gets a pass actually, that album's a masterpiece.
I come from a generation of dokie dokie.
This is where Blue Castle Games took over production, and not only do I think Dead Rising 2 stays beyond faithful to the original game, but took things in an even more extreme direction that innovated and expanded on what was present in the first game. The intro sets things up really well, showing we're now playing as a new character called Chuck Green, a character who's much more grounded than the sometimes bizarre Frank West. Some people might not like this, as overall you could say a lot more characters in this game are actually realistic, as opposed to what were essentially caricatures in the original. original, but I've never had a problem with them. After the zombie outbreak in Willamette, it's only natural for the human race to capitalize on these undead creatures, showing there's now TV shows like Terror is Reality, which we're participating in, which literally consists of a bunch of games where zombies get torn to shreds. But as you could assume, things go wrong very quickly, resulting in yet another outbreak, this time in Fortune City. This time round, we're not just in a mall, but a full-blown casino town, increasing the scale quite dramatically over the first game. The level in which this game balances both quality of life improvements on top of innovating, all while never losing the original base of the first game, is masterful. Well, I say that, but there are some aspects I might see as an improvement, but others might not like. One of the clearest examples of this is how the zombies function, which, to put bluntly, are nowhere near as threatening as the first game, despite this time being even more packed into these environments, with the amount of zombies that are present appearing to be huge. The way they act has been tweaked slightly to create what I consider a more satisfying experience. They're a lot less grabby, and whereas in the first game you could try to push them out the way, you'd also oftentimes end up getting grabbed. Whereas here, once Chuck's arms start flailing, the zombies get stunned quite considerably, making it hard for them to stop you. The zombies' appearances are also considerably more varied, admittedly having fat bald ones and bobbed hair women pop up much more often, but you'll also be seeing many more unique zombies scattered amongst the crowd. I suppose it's subjective what approach you prefer, as it undoubtedly turns the zombies into more of a gory spectacle, as opposed to an actual threat, but I don't see any issue in going more in this direction, especially because it's been balanced so well. It's only backed up even more by the refined visuals and gameplay. Whereas the first game's visuals were rather unique, they were also brought down by elements like how flat the lighting was, and the unavoidably ancient looking character models. In Dead Rising 2, everything's been amplified to an incredible degree. The zombies look even more decayed and gross. The characters included not only look better in a technical sense, but in my opinion also have considerably more recognizable personalities. Both Chuck and his allies are kind of blank slates for me, not being awful, but much like the first game, just sort of being caricatures. This is the love interest. This is the sexier love interest who will tempt Chuck. This is the questionable leader who will inevitably turn on you. It's once again the over-the-top characters that steal the show. I think TK is a hilarious antagonist. The Bailey twins initially seem like a pair of typical twats, but then turn out to be awesome samurai fighters. And amazingly, I think the psychopaths managed to be just as, if not even better than the first game. So many excellent appearances here, most of them boiling down to a typical brawl once again, but the stories that accompany some of these are sometimes quite gripping and sad, like Ted, who takes care of a tiger called Snowflake, eventually offering himself up to feed the thing. The fight which accompanies this is also insane. You're literally fighting a fucking tiger. And also Brent Ernst, or rather Slappy, who wears a mascot costume and laments his opportunity to go on a date with the other mascot, Louise Jameson. It's exciting to see a game go crazy like this. Despite the somewhat serious presentation and plot which is laid out, it's not afraid to both be laughed with and at. Of course, how could I forget the biggest innovation, the weapon combinations? These are hands down my favourite addition to the game, and arguably revitalizes the entire gameplay system into something even more extreme and awesome. Essentially, almost every item in the game now has a specific item that it can be combined with to create an even more effective weapon. These must be placed on workbenches scattered around, which we gain access to quite early on, and you'll always be able to tell which weapons are combinable by the blue wrench symbol which hovers above any given item. Most, if not all, the weapons are not only incredibly effective, but also have some really creative designs. Combining an axe and a sledgehammer gives you the Defiler, combining boxing gloves with a Bowie knife turns you into Wolverine, and combining a flashlight and gems gives you a fucking lightsaber. This gives so many more possibilities to experiment with any given item scattered around this zombie sandbox. Not all weapons can be used in these combinations, but there's such a huge range which can be used that you'll never be thinking there was more potential in this mechanic. Slicing up zombies is even more satisfying this time round. With the improved graphics, we now bear witness to even more blood and brains than before. Specific weapons like swords and axes will dismember and split open the zombies accurately, so if your sword appears to cut through the top half of their body, you'll only see that part be cut off. This was also in the first game, but as you can assume, it looks much better here. Guns are also much more satisfying to use, sending zombies flying through the air, with limbs cascading off in several directions. It also fixes a minor issue I mentioned, now having an appropriate animation when aiming, and also giving us the ability to move and shoot at the same time. The clothing from the first game has been expanded majorly, including more items to make you look cool, stupid, or just standard. The only issue I have is that there's particular clothing you can only get access to by purchasing it, not only being annoying due to the fact I also think these are some of the more nicely designed pieces, but on top of that, they also give you passive upgrades, which make the whole experience much easier. There's 4 of these in total, all of which you can mix and match, which will actually stack the other clothing's upgrades on top of each other, which pretty much removes any and all challenge from the gameplay. The ninja clothing makes zombies not notice you, the psycho clothing gives damage reduction, the soldier clothing increases damage, and sports clothing gives you a ×3 speed boost. And that's just one effect in each clothing. They have multiple on top of that. As I said, it's not only ridiculous you have to pay for that stuff, but even when I have paid for it, I'm not really sure I'd want all those upgrades. If there was a way I could just wear the clothing without them, I think it would have presented more balance and freedom. Missions are pretty much exactly the same, although there's considerably more this time round, which is very welcome. I felt in the first game there were too many instances where you were pretty much told to either wait around or just kill zombies, which did give a freedom I suppose, but also made the experience feel less focused, and sometimes completely aimless. Due to the increased amount of missions, you now almost always have actual things to complete. The wait between both the case files and when you need to give your daughter Zombrex can sometimes be long, but is spruced up consistently by both rescue and psychopath quests. The Zombrex element would seem to be a nuisance on the surface, but never goes far enough to either be impactful or annoying. It's just another aspect you need to prepare for, either collecting enough money to buy it from a store, or more often than not, just complete a quest which will crop up around the same time you need to give Katie Zombrex. That's what I mean. I don't really understand having this actually be a gameplay mechanic if you're never really given any opportunity to actually fail. I'm always surprised when going back to the first game that money played no part in anything, as in this game, despite not being absolutely essential, it can be used to make quite impactful choices. It can be acquired in multiple ways, breaking open ATMs and cash registers, playing poker with people, and interacting with the many arcade and slot machines. This is primarily used in the brand new stores scattered around, either to buy new weapons, emergency Zombrex, or keys to brand new vehicles. In a lot of locations, there's actually vehicles you can ride around in, controlling considerably better than the ones in the first game, and also being more varied. We've got bikes, an SUV, a sports car, and even a tiny bicycle to cause havoc with. These always respawn when entering whatever area they're in, and the SUV found in the outside section is particularly brilliant, as you can wipe out large hordes with it, and also traverse what's quite a big section much faster. It's the small details which I think matter in this game, and because I think I know it so well, I'll try and prove that by listing off a bunch of stuff that I both like and dislike. Drinking too much alcohol will make Chuck sick, not only being a hilariously realistic consequence for such a wacky game, but also presenting an actual threat, as there'll be certain areas where you might be in quite a tight spot and have no other option than to keep drinking. The zombies carrying knives make a comeback. You can interact with pretty much every single slot machine and actually win money from them. There's a huge amount of interactable environmental objects, being a fun distraction and make the areas feel more interactive as opposed to static. The survivor AI is much improved, not getting stuck as much in both the environment and the zombies. When you drive vehicles, your characters literally don't move at all, which is both weird and blatantly lazy. Holding down the attack button with most weapons will more often than not give you a stronger attack with an up-close kill animation, making the zombies you take out even more satisfying. Despite the overall upgrade in graphical fidelity, there's some strange artifacting issues, which do become distracting after a while. I like how you're never told things like how you can bring toys back for Katie. It leaves room for a nice surprise. And
I was wondering why that sounded so
Let's
familiar.
start going real specific now. The smaller icons, which show you both where your mission is and also where the survivors are, have much more clarity, and the arrow this time round is much less misleading than the first game. The random events which take place return from the first game, but arguably change things more drastically. Whereas before we had the cultists who were pretty much just like the zombies, now we get thrust into situations like being sniped all across the strip by psychos. And, of course, the infamous Ted and Snowflake encounter. We also had 3 different Dead Rising 2 related games, the first of which being Case Zero, which was basically a tech demo. Then you had the non-canon Off the Record, which replaced Chuck with Frank West, introducing some new areas in the sandbox mode, ultimately going down as the fan favourite of the franchise, tied with the first. And we also had Case West, which was basically an epilogue to the main game, which isn't terrible, but definitely should have actually been part of the base game, and not sold separately. I'd say overall, Dead Rising 2 might be the perfect sequel. It focuses on all the elements that made the first game great, and refined them. I suppose you could say its one pitfall was the story, perhaps not being as gripping or memorable as the first, due to the much grittier tone. But the story in these games I personally see just as a reason for the gameplay. We've already established that just wandering around killing things will eventually be tiresome, but giving you an actual reason to go around killing things, even if it's to progress a story that you don't really care about, at least gives you a greater sense of progression. Now, Dead Rising 3 is an interesting one. It was my first time playing when recording, primarily due to its exclusivity to their Xbox One. But even now that we can buy it on PC, and even though I had fairly low expectations with this one, it met those expectations in a lot of aspects, disappointed me in even more aspects, and surprised me in a few. Let's just start with what I bared witness to right when launching the game. We've now got multiple modes: Story Mode, Nightmare Mode, and Untold Stories. Untold Stories is a set of DLCs following some characters you meet in the main game. But Story and Nightmare Mode is the base game split up into two separate things. Story Mode is the casual way to play the game, having autosaves, basically a non-existent timer, and much easier zombies. But Nightmare Mode has you save in toilets, stricter times on missions, and of course, deadlier threats. This is such an annoying addition, as Nightmare Mode for the most part is the true Dead Rising experience, but ideally, I didn't want the increased difficulty, not because it's actually hard, but just because zombies in this game are more annoying to kill than ever before. But in reality, because of how this game is laid out, I see Story Mode as the preferable way to play for me personally. This is mainly because we're now in a fully open world, not just an expansive area, but several handcrafted wide open sections. I'll talk about that in a sec, but just witness that absolute mess I was initially shown. It makes a bad impression straight away, solely down to this awful PC port. They've got the frame rate locked to 30 FPS off the bat. No matter what resolution and what frame rate I set the game to, it wouldn't change. So I had to actually go into the game files, create an ini file with a piece of text unlocking the frame rate, and then when going back into the game, I was now met with an inventory that would pop up for a millisecond and some seizure-inducing aim issues. This was down to the fact I have a 144Hz monitor, and the game apparently shits itself when going anywhere over 60 FPS. For a game released in 2014, this port is embarrassing on that front, and I don't blame someone for refunding it straight away. However, when we got all those issues solved, we do genuinely get a game with much improved graphics. But this also comes with a downside, which I'll talk about in a sec. Now, I think the open world was the only natural progression to the series, but it's one that I think they didn't pull off that well. Because the map's much bigger and more open than previous games, I think the areas here are a lot less memorable. Take a screenshot of any area in the past Dead Rising games, and I'm sure most fans will be pretty confident they can tell you what that area is. But take a screenshot from this game and things start to blend together. The open world links to a huge amount of problems I have with this game, so let's just get through them now. Because there's no real base of operations, missions have been completely switched to cater to this. Side missions now have ridiculously large timers, so large that on story mode, you'll only ever miss these if you're purposely not trying to do them. And for the story missions, the timer's gone completely, which, I mean, I have no idea why they did this, but there you go. The missions here fall into a much more standard bracket. Main missions often have you going to somewhere, meeting new characters, and maybe have a boss fight or some other set piece. These are all fine, and there's none I really had an issue with. Side missions though, excluding the psychopath encounters, are in my opinion absolutely dreadful. There was a sense of satisfaction to all the side quests in previous games, as despite being pretty bland, and usually just leading someone back to the safe house, you actually felt like you were helping out survivors, all of which you can interact with when they get saved. A lot of these also had quite strange personalities, once again livening up what could be a pretty boring gameplay mechanic. But here, because you're not saving these people, almost every single side quest has now been turned into a fetch quest. Find a handgun, find a grenade, find some food, find some spray cans. You're collecting these things and taking them back, that's it. And what do we get in return? Some PP and typically an ally that will help you out in battle. And by help you out, that usually just means hanging around before they either die or you abandon them. I don't think allies are a bad idea in theory, but they're just useless in comparison to what we can do. Talking of PP, this game was released in 2013, so you can guarantee the lazy open world game design seeps into every corner here. Instead of the convenient and satisfying progression from previous games, we now get a bulky skill tree, complicating the entire process. This really feels like changing stuff for the sake of it, because it it brings absolutely no depth. You get 1 attribute point to spend between levels 1 to 15, 2 points between levels 15 to 30, and 3 for any level above 30. I think I leveled up my health about twice, because I was more focused on dealing damage and filling my pockets with weapons. I dumped tons in the combo categories so I could experiment around more, and I'll be honest, I wanted to put most in the inventory slots. For some reason, they thought it was necessary to change the quick, albeit somewhat clunky inventory system the previous games had, into this scrolling wheel thing. It would be fine, but we start off with 4 slots, which is ridiculous. It feels so restrictive to have this little inventory space, as well as having the inventory skill tree be one of the hardest to level up, especially in a game with this many combo weapons. Early on, I couldn't go 5 minutes without having to do this annoying process of dropping a couple weapons so I could pick up 2 other things to combine, and then taking back my other stuff, which, because of the annoying pickup system, usually meant picking up about 100 items around the weapon I actually want to pick up. And the actual process of combo weapons in this game has been severely dampened as well. Because our character's a repairman, we can now create any combo weapon on the fly, which sounds good initially, but in practice, I've got to say, it removed near to all the excitement around these things. The feeling of finally finding that chainsaw while carrying around a useless paddle for ages, only to create this Goliath of a weapon, was so satisfying. But in this game, it's much quicker and more efficient, but also much more lame. The music is just this tiny loop that sounds like it's trying to be exciting, but just fails. You're told exactly what you're creating when combining the weapons, completely removing the anticipation that was clearly supposed to be present in Dead Rising 2.
Let's kick some ass.
Oh yeah.
And worse of all for me, the combos aren't even accurate anymore, which once again I presume is due to the open world, and how you can't really assume a particular weapon will be scattered around any area. The range of stuff you can create in this game is downright incredible, with the combo vehicles being easily one of the coolest additions. But this comes at the consequence of having every weapon now blend into each other. So if you want to make knife gloves, you don't solely need the Bowie knife and boxing gloves like before. You can now literally combine any knife and glove together and you'll get it. Same goes for ranged weapons. You can combine a knife and a handgun and you'll get a sawed-off shotgun with a machete on it. I know these games are goofy. Well, we'll get onto that in a sec. But it literally makes no sense, and also completely removes any importance from these items. This just leads on to several other points which drag this experience down. Because there's so many variations of weapons, it's hard to become attached to particular ones like in previous games. Not to mention that some of their functionalities now start to cross over. Instead of being able to make whatever you want as long as you have the right stuff, you now need the right blueprints, which are scattered literally all over the entire map, and also have the right combo categories leveled up in the skill tree. And what may be a positive for some people, but for me just looks like a convenience for the open design. Whenever you go into one of the many safe houses around the map, you've got a weapons locker, letting you access every single weapon that you've either picked up, created, or bought as DLC. Luckily, the only edition you can buy on PC now is the full edition. But still, I don't think these much superior weapons should have ever been locked away behind a paywall. It just feels lazy, to say the least. If you're worried about running low on ammo, or being unable to find good weapons, just go to a safe house and get a ton of stuff you've had in the past. The atmosphere and tone of this game is so off, I can't even describe it. If any of you remember the Dead Island 2 trailer, and some of the leaked gameplay which came out, I think that is the exact direction they should have gone in. But instead, they remove almost every trace of charm and personality from the previous games, and replace it with the most grey and boring atmosphere I've experienced in a game for a while. No more colourful wonderlands and neon lights, but dark and lifeless streets and shops. The music was such a key element in the previous games. It's not only one of my favourite game soundtracks, being the ultimate Muzak experience, but it fit the environment so well, and had this constant hilarious juxtaposition between fighting these blood-hungry zombies and mentally insane civilians. Now we get near to nothing, just these really slow, drony tracks in the back, some of which aren't terrible, but nothing great either. Some of the music in the cutscenes and boss fights I was quite surprised with, going more in the direction of an 80s Uncut Gems type vibe. and those tracks are pretty good. But as I said, it's mainly the visuals that I have a problem with, and you can see why by all the gameplay that's been playing. There's elements here from the past games which basically stick out like a sore thumb, and make me dreadfully sad they didn't follow suit with that direction here. But it is what it is. As for the overall gameplay, it's shit, I've got to be honest. Killing zombies for me has never been less satisfying. I think this is down to a lot of elements. Because the map's bigger, you spend a large amount of time in cars, racking up that kill count by just aimlessly crushing zombies in front of you. And even when you're on foot, killing zombies now feels pointless because of the sheer amount of them. You barely ever feel like you're clearing any of them out, or making a path forward, because there's always going to be tons you won't be able to deal with. So ultimately, unless you want to try out a weapon, running through them is the easiest option. Survivors aren't really an issue anymore, so you don't have to spend any time protecting them or yourself. So really, its biggest innovation is easily its biggest downfall. More zombies means more things to kill, which means even more opportunity to get tired of killing. What I found extra weird was the removal of money and stores. I suppose they just couldn't find a way to put it in because, well, I don't really know why. The point of money in Dead Rising 2 was to either buy things to save you time or to play poker games, both of which aren't in this game for some reason. I don't think they understood how many people spent their time just betting over and over until they got that one big jackpot. And even the poker, why would you remove that? It's just a fun little pastime that I'm sure a lot of people would have gotten enjoyment out of. It's like if Red Dead 2 got rid of Five Finger Fillet. It just doesn't make any sense. The story and characters here as well are much weaker. But debatably, as the game goes on, becomes the game's biggest asset. Nick will never be as memorable as Frank or Chuck, but he's not too bad. Instead of being an absolute beast like the previous two, he's more out of his depth, which for some people could make them relate to him more. The characters we interact with are basically at the same level of memorability, but strangely, there's some here that I really liked, mainly because of their performances. Characters like Gary and Rhonda are genuinely quite good, and Gary in particular has quite a compelling performance.
People's lives are at stake. How about my life is at stake? How about you think about me for a change? How about you give a shit about that? The boss has been on my case all this time over this Annie girl and bringing her back here. Well, I finally got her in there. Hold up, no thanks to you. For all I know, he'll off me if she gets away again, and he's gonna be here soon. I got anything to live for anyway.
The villains, I literally barely remember. There's one in a wheelchair and another who's a military guy, about as cliche as you could get. But ultimately, going through the story this time round, I think will be a lot more subjective. I can assume there's just as many people who hate the timer in these games compared to those who like it. I personally am in favour of it, as it hides some of the gameplay's blander moments. But I can understand wanting to do things at your own pace. And same goes for the story. Both previous games have been about discovering a mystery, whereas this is more focused on the sole situation of getting out of town. I actually got more invested as the game went on, and by the end of the game, when Chuck makes his grand return, and it's revealed our love interest was his daughter Katie, I was fully in. The themes of the story aren't particularly that interesting, but quite poignant, especially in today's terms. I was a lot more interested in the capitalist and consumerist money-focused side of the previous games, stemming close to my love of the actual George Romero films. Zombies go to the mall and casino in these games because us zombies in the real world flock to this stuff which only loses us money. It's not a subtle metaphor, but I like it. This game is much more focused on the drug side of things, having Zombrex from the previous game be replaced with Zombrex chips, which actually have GPS tracking in them. It's not that focused on, or even particularly shown, unlike the previous games subtly did, but it's at least there. The psychopath fights in this game felt much lesser than previous games, and I mean that in the most literal sense. I thought there were less encounters, but the ones we do have actually turn out to be some of the most interesting and varied selections so far. The first fight is against Z, and is basically as standard as you could get, an all-out brawl with a Guandao wielding maniac. But the fights that I was more interested in were against people like Albert and Diego. Not only do these two fights both take place in quite unique environments, but the way they function is not how you typically expect a psychopath to act. Albert's fight includes several alternate versions of himself walking around, where you'll then need to find the real version and kill him. It's really basic, but it's something we haven't seen in the franchise up to this point. And Diego's fight has him flying all around this space-themed area, shooting down fire. Something I can assume people won't like is how these fights are much easier to handle, with a lot of them almost turning into quick-time events, where you can pretty much just perform the finishing move on them by using the Y and B combo over and over. But I've got to be honest, I kinda like the switch up. It makes some of these encounters much more unique, which especially helps considering how a lot of these have also been dumbed down as a result of the overall darker and more serious tone. So, now that we've covered the main aspects, let's look at the smaller things. Multiplayer makes a return from Dead Rising 2. I didn't try it in either game when recording, considering I've got no one to play with, but my memories of playing with friends in the previous game are strong, so I can only assume with the bigger world, it must have presented even more freedom and fun experiences. The inclusion of a sprint button is very much appreciated, although I once again think this was either put in due to the skill tree or just changing things for the sake of it. You had speed increases in the previous games, and it's not like sprinting in this game makes avoiding zombies any easier. And in fact, the movement in general, but especially when you're sprinting, is really shit. You feel like an absolute tank, but it does present new skill moves like the shoulder tackle, which can be quite useful. The clunky movement can sometimes be horrible, especially with this new camera system. For some reason, games have gone in the direction of having the camera really close to your character. It's a trend that became very prevalent after The Last of Us, but was pretty much becoming common throughout the 7th generation of consoles. It can sometimes be put to great effect, actually drawing you closer to the characters and their journey, but it has to be the right type of angles and the right type of game. Resident Evil 4 has a similar camera, but it never feels intrusive. It's zoomed out enough so that Leon's not taking up a huge amount of space. The recent God of War is an example of having this camera badly implemented. The story might reflect this type of camera inclusion, but it hampers the gameplay in a major way, and that's exactly how I see it in this game, but without the story reasons. Just compare the differences between this and the previous games. Nick takes up a ridiculous amount of space in the screen. Also notice how the camera's on a level plane with Nick, whereas the previous games had the camera set above the characters by default to give you a larger view of the environment. I get it's part of the gritty aesthetic, but having the camera be this close, and also adding quite an intense camera shake effect, did make me feel slightly nauseous at points. And finally, the collectibles scattered around this game are so unnecessary. All they give you is some extra points, and being one step closer to a checkbox. There's no reason to go around shooting every speaker, collecting every trophy, and looking at every tragic accident. It's that horrible Ubisoft influence seeping its way in once again, and it's only the blueprints that I could understand being scattered around. But as I said, I already think locking away these combos was a bad idea. Overall, I grew to appreciate Dead Rising 3 a bit more by the time I finished, but still can't deny it's a massive step down. It feels like it's been made by a completely different company, as despite having all these innovative new features, I found myself time and time again only becoming excited when I saw something I recognized from the previous games. I've got to be honest, the atmosphere really drags this game down. It should not have gone for this serious tone, be that in the visuals, the sound, or the bulk of characters we see. Heading into a cutscene with a Blanca mask just feels inappropriate in this game, but at the same time there's points where it's not. It's a lot more mixed up than the other games, because I could spend a lot of time complaining about the serious tone, and then Darlene or Dylan Fuentes will come along and make me look like an absolute dick. Pun initially not intended, but now definitely intended. Both of those cutscenes are hilarious, by the way. Some of the most memorable moments from the series for me. There are things I'm just not sure about in this game, but they appear to be more subjective. Having the timer be essentially absent feels like it's taking us far away from the series' roots, but is also understandable due to the increased scale. Having some of the best weapons and vehicles be acquired by just going into a locker doesn't feel satisfying, but seems a lot more convenient than aimlessly wandering around, trying to find some items that make exactly what you want. I wouldn't say it's a bad game particularly, I think it's just a bad Dead Rising game. And here we are, the game that pretty much killed the entire franchise.
You just love making me look like an asshole, don't you?
For some reason, I really wanted to like this game. The amount of hate this game got when it came out was unreal. People not just making videos about why it's bad, but actually trying to specify the amount of time it took to make that bad. And to be honest, no word of a lie, it quite possibly has my favorite intro sequence in the entire series. You start the game off destroying a ridiculous amount of zombies in this dream sequence, get some admittedly dreadful cutscenes.
Alright, when I'm driving.
What? No, this is my car.
And then after the initial break into this compound, we get a really nice animated sequence. But after that, everything falls down. And I mean, I'm giving this game a large pass considering things were falling down within the first 30 minutes. God, where do I start? Well, let's just start by saying this isn't a Dead Rising game. It's got some outfits, some characters, and some weapons you might know from the past games, but they've been completely transformed into something incredibly boring. We're back playing as Frank West, a decision which clearly came from the developers' heavy emphasis on going back to the series' roots.
It is the 10th year anniversary of our game, and we wanted to go back to our roots.
Frank is cooler, he's tougher, a little wiser, but he's still Frank.
Just kind of stuffy in here, don't you think? A little fresh air here. I really thought that would work.
More ways to kill him, more combo vehicles, a whole new mystery to solve. We brought back our favorite character, Frank, and we still maintain what was really core to Dead Rising. I think fans are gonna love it.
But this time, he's not only voiced by a different person, but acts nothing like he did in any of these games. And they're aware of it. They actively paint him out to be an absolute prank in this game, which, from my understanding, was never really the intention of his character. Every other character we meet throughout our journey is the most carbon copy, boring group I've ever seen. I can't even remember the amount of times I said, "Who's that?" when talking to someone we supposedly know. The story is particularly uninteresting. It's got none of the intrigue or charm that elevated the previous games. This time we've got boring characters shooting one-liners back and forth at each other, villains who are set up so poorly that you see them about once before actually
I hope
killing
I don't
them,
get
and an
sick
overall
from
narrative
it.
that's just aimless. You start off the game
with
thinking
this
it's revolved around
probably
revealing a
not.
conspiracy, which is unoriginal anyway considering the first game, which then evolves into a plot where you're taking down the head of this faction called Obscurus, and then by the end you're focused on fighting an exo-zombie. It's terrible. The tone is completely off the entire game. There's no clever balance between being serious and comical anymore. It's just gone the direction of a Marvel movie.
Oh shit.
The gameplay this time round, I've got to be honest, is horrendous. That initial intro wasn't some kind of power trip akin to games like God of War 2. That's honestly how everything plays. Zombies are quite literally not a threat anymore. You can wipe tons out with a single swing of pretty much anything. Their bones are basically paper. The issues I had with combo weapons are still present here, and are only amplified even further due to how this game's balanced. I'm playing on normal difficulty, which is a difficulty setting I've always assumed most people play on, and is ideally the most balanced experience in any game. Normal does also mean conventional after all. The issue of difficulty is big in this game, as not only does it mean I'm hardly paying attention to what I'm doing, just mindlessly pressing the square button to wipe out hordes of zombies, but in my playthrough, it basically removed the need for combo weapons entirely. It doesn't make much sense that Frank can make these combo weapons in the first place, which is something even both of the previous games gave context for. Chuck being a bike enthusiast, and Nick being a straight-up engineer. But ultimately, it felt like the series was regressing. I didn't feel that overwhelming sense of variety like in Dead Rising 3.
I plan to
because
do
I simply
Megas
didn't find any blueprints or craft particular weapons,
Z
as almost everything
Aura.
was
I don't
things
even know how to
efficiently.
say that. I don't know who that character
You'll have a
is.
hard time breaking any of these.
Where's that
They
character
even
from?
take zombies out fairly effectively without slowing you down. The game not only feels like it doesn't incentivize the same creativity from previous games, but I'm almost 100% sure there's even less weapons to create than previous games. I have no idea how that happened.
More ways to kill him, more ways to kill him, more ways to kill him.
Streamlining, I guess? But come on, just let people make what they want. Not to mention, the weapon system has been redone from the ground up. Not only convoluting a process that's already become quite confusing over the past two games, but just...
It's a legendary Pokemon.
Melee, ranged, and throwable weapons are now all confined to their own separate sections, which can be switched by either tapping left,
really
up,
have a
or
lot
right
of
on the
Pokemon
D-pad,
Avatar
or
games.
holding them down to get a similar menu to Dead Rising 3. This
Like,
gives
I
you
need
a
to
huge
play
advantage
Shield,
immediately, because from the start of the game,
and
you
then
now
that's
have
pretty
access
much
to a
it.
total of 12 weapon slots, all of which can now be expanded separately, meaning that you could eventually have 24 slots. And, as you might have noticed, healing has been streamlined too, in the worst way imaginable. Healing items can still be found extremely frequently, but they now get sent to the bottom bottom left of the screen, underneath your health bar, which, as you can notice, isn't the life cubes anymore, making the experience even easier in my opinion. From the start, you can now store 3 healing items, which are completely exempt from any of the other weapon slots. Clearly, this removes a huge amount of strategy that was present in the previous games. You no longer have to consider if you want to be precautious and take more healing with you, or stack up on more weapons. With the removal of magazines as well, being turned into permanent upgrades with the training manuals, everything has been separated so you never have to think about what you're actually picking up. I actually think the visuals in this game are much improved. The atmosphere is almost completely gone. Bland is the only word that really comes to mind. But the overall graphical upgrade, less dark environments, and particularly the blood and gore physics, I think they got spot on. I wouldn't say it's as detailed as Dead Rising 3, but I think the visual aesthetic is an overall step up. It's a shame the atmosphere is not any better though, especially considering this is our final grand return to Willamette, the place where it all started. I think the inclusion of even a remnant of the first game would have been appreciated, but the most we get is your usual Blanca masks, and thankfully the return of some classic tracks from the first 2 games, although these are only played in specific areas. The soundtrack's still primarily boring droney stuff. There are almost no qualities they don't mess up in this game. The missions and overall story progression has been utterly destroyed, as they've taken the ballsy move to completely remove the timer this time. If anything in a game this easy, some sense of urgency should have been here. And talking of the missions, what you actually do in these range from an utterly boring and repetitive cycle of clearing out safe houses and killing zombies around civilians, which, similar to the previous game, lack any impact or uniqueness, which I primarily assume stems back to the open world design. They literally try to trick you into thinking things will be more interesting with this sole go-karting mission at the start of the game, which I did think was cool, but this is it. This is the extent of how good the side missions get, and to be honest, I think it's a compliment calling them side missions. I mean, they've been renamed to encounters, so I guess that's how they thought they'd get away with it, but it makes the lack of actual side missions even more present. Then, in the main missions, as I said, we follow one of the most uninspired and lifeless stories I've played from a game in a while, with most missions usually boiling down to clear out this room of zombies, defeat the Obscura soldiers, defeat the Obscura soldiers, defeat the Obscura soldiers. Missions now pretty much all revolve around the human enemies in a game franchise called Dead Rising. There are some interesting elements like the camera investigations, which requires you to use several modes on your camera to piece together clues. But, of course, they take a fairly good mechanic like this and overuse it to the point where it actually becomes unenjoyable. The most unforgivable new addition is easily the Maniacs, completely removing the psychopaths from previous games. What distinguishes the two is that psychopaths were unique encounters, sometimes discovered in unique locations, and always had a unique opening and closing cutscene that sometimes conveyed an extremely rich and interesting personality within a very short amount of time. The reason I keep saying unique is because the Maniacs remove all of that, and intentionally too. I'm pretty sure the whole idea of these was supposed to be like you've stumbled across some messed up enemy in the open world, not taking you away from the moment by putting you in a cutscene, but the fact you actually get notified of their location makes everything I just said void. All the fights against these guys are quite...
Wow. Well, anyways, I didn't actually expect this to actually do it this quick. But yeah, pretty much finished the avatar. I mean, just need to do a few extra bits, but yeah. This is where I went in the stream. Yeah, it's a short one. I'm sorry. But I hope you guys all enjoyed watching. And bye-bye! Hope you guys look like how it's turning out. Quack, 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 quack. Wait, what? Quack, 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 quack. Quack, 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 quack.